About 1.2 miles from the main trail, hidden among dense vegetation, Ashford's horse was tied to a tree. The animal was visibly agitated and hungry, abandoned for days but alive. It had scraped the ground around the tree repeatedly, deep circles in the earth suggesting days of panic. But it was tied with a careful, deliberate knot. This wasn't the work of someone panicking. On the ground, a few feet from the horse, lay the inspector's satchel. Partially open, its contents remained untouched. Every note still folded, every document in place, even the dried food hadn't been touched. The revolver was there, loaded, unfired. There were no signs of struggle. No blood stained the surrounding leaves, no drag marks in the damp soil, no torn coat caught on nearby branches. It was as if Ashford had simply dismounted, tied the horse carefully, placed the satchel on the ground in an orderly fashion, and walked into the forest of his own accord. But why? What would make an experienced man, armed, carrying federal money, voluntarily abandon everything? Cantrell examined the area carefully. The ground was disturbed. Ashford's boot prints were visible, walking toward the nearby creek. But there was something else. Smaller footprints, barefoot, multiple sets, people. And near the roots of an old tree, partially hidden under leaves, bone fragments. Too small to be human, thin ribs from a small animal. Perhaps rabbit, but mixed in was something larger, a fragment of long bone that could be from deer or from a horse. Cantrell ordered tracking dogs to be brought. 2 days passed before the animals arrived from a neighboring county. The dogs picked up a trail almost immediately, following something invisible to human eyes through the dense vegetation. For 200 yards they pulled their chains with determination, leading the men toward a shallow creek that snaked down the valley. But when they reached the bank, the dogs began to circle, confused, losing the scent entirely. Water eliminates odors. Any experienced tracker knew this. The search expanded. 40 men scoured the region, their voices echoing in ravines as they shouted Ashford's name. They investigated natural caves, examined every depression in the ground that could hide a body. They found only more abandoned cabins. And there were dozens of them, structures from old hunters, failed attempts to establish farms, shelters from families who had given up on the mountains decades ago. But then, during an expanded sweep in the 3rd week, a team found something that would change the nature of the investigation. 3 miles from where Ashford's horse had been discovered, in a small clearing obscured by dense bushes, there was another horse, also abandoned, also tied with the same type of careful, deliberate knot. The animal had been dead for a long time. Only skeleton remained, still attached by the rotted rope to the tree trunk. Near the horse's bones, a hunter's satchel deteriorated by time. Rusted rifle leaning against a rock. Water canteen fallen among roots. When Cantrell investigated the belongings, a local resident accompanying the search immediately recognized the rifle as belonging to William Hodge, who had disappeared 6 months earlier. The family had assumed he'd gotten lost or been attacked by a bear. No one had connected the cases until now. 2 disappearances, same general area, same pattern. Horses left tied, belongings untouched. And in Hodge's case, the horse had been left to starve slowly, still tied to the tree. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an opportunistic animal attack. Something, or someone, was deliberately choosing victims, luring them away from their transportation through some method that left no signs of struggle, and making them disappear. The starved horse suggested something even more disturbing. Whoever was doing this had no need for the animal. This wasn't robbery. This wasn't desperate survival. This was something different. Cantrell felt the full weight of realization as he looked at Hodge's horse skeleton. If Hodge had disappeared 6 months earlier, and Ashford 3 months ago, how long had this been happening? How many other solitary travelers, hunters, herb gatherers had been recorded as lost when the truth was far darker? The rains came in the 4th week, violent storms that turned trails into rivers of mud and erased any trace that might have remained. After a month of increasingly desperate searches, reality began to impose itself. The Smokies covered thousands of acres of unexplored territory. A body, or several, could be mere steps from a trail and remain invisible for years under vegetation that grew in dense layers. Marshal Cantrell wasn't a man to give up easily, but he knew when he needed to fundamentally change strategy. They weren't looking for lost or injured men anymore. They were looking for places where people had been hidden. The Ashford family, desperate, offered a reward of $500 for information leading to the inspector's whereabouts, a fortune that could change any local farmer's life. Even so, no one came forward with answers. But Cantrell had a growing suspicion that kept him awake at night. If there was a predator, and now he was convinced there was, then there were lairs, places of return, bases, and in the mountains that meant structures, abandoned cabins, large caves, perhaps even hidden camps that no one had discovered in decades. It was only when they stopped looking for the men and began paying systematic attention to the structures they found, cataloging each one, investigating even those that seemed abandoned for years, that the true nature of the horror began to emerge from the shadows. But this would take more time, more patience, and unfortunately, more blood. Meanwhile, in a closed valley several miles away, in a cabin that no official map recorded, life continued in its primitive rhythm. Low fire kept flies away from meat drying on crude hooks. Clean bones were stacked with others, human mixed with animal without distinction or ceremony. And two pairs of eyes watched the distant trails through openings in the wooden wall, waiting patiently for the next person solitary enough to approach. June brought humid heat that made the entire forest seem to ferment. The smell of vegetable decomposition, rotting trunks and wildflowers mixed into a sickening perfume. The official search for Ashford had ended, but Marshal Cantrell maintained occasional patrols with willing volunteers, more out of stubbornness than real hope. It was during one of these sweeps, on June 16th, that a group led by Dutch Hensley found something that would transform the nature of the investigation. The cabin was hidden almost deliberately, nestled between moss-covered rock formations and wrapped in vegetation so dense it would be invisible beyond 20 feet. Hensley almost walked right past it, but his hunting dog began sniffing obsessively toward the structure, a behavior any experienced man recognized as a sign of something dead nearby. Pushing through tangled bushes that scratched arms and tore clothes, the group emerged into a small clearing where the cabin crumbled in silence. Decades of abandonment were evident at first glance. Partially collapsed roof left exposed beams, door hanging on a single rusted hinge, and what remained of windows long empty of any glass. The interior smelled exactly as expected: deep mold, accumulated animal feces, and the odor of rotted wood. Branches invaded through holes in the roof. Dead leaves covered the floor in layers. Small animals had clearly made nests in the corners, evidence of occupation only by raccoons and squirrels. The men were about to leave when Hensley noticed something peculiar about the floorboards near what had been a stone fireplace. Some were loose, slightly elevated compared to the others. Curious more than suspicious, he knelt and pulled one of the boards. The wood was so rotten at the base that it came away easily. Below, in a shallow grave dug directly into the packed earth, 3 human skulls stared at them with empty eye sockets. Hensley recoiled so violently that he tripped over his own feet, falling backward among the dead leaves. His shout brought the other men running. For a long moment that seemed to stretch, no one spoke. They just stood there, looking at the grave, at the skulls resting in slightly displaced positions. There were no remains of skin, hair, or tissue, only clean bone, discolored by time and damp earth. The skulls had been separated from the rest of the skeletons. There were no vertebrae, no attached mandibles in 2 cases, no other bone visible in the grave. The heads had been removed and buried here, while the rest of the bodies were where? One of the skulls showed an obvious fracture running from the top to the right eye socket, a fatal blow, probably delivered by a heavy instrument. Cantrell was called immediately and arrived with 2 assistants and a local doctor who had some experience examining mortal remains. The on-site analysis was necessarily basic. Without advanced forensic science, all they could determine was that the skulls were from adults based on bone development, probably different individuals based on slightly varied sizes and characteristics, and that they had been there for considerable time. Years, possibly. He ordered systematic excavation around the cabin. 4 men dug for hours, creating trenches in a grid pattern. They found only intertwined roots and stones. They investigated the interior, removing layers of debris. No other bones. And then, in a corner that had escaped initial attention, one of the men found something hanging from a rusted hook on the wall. Rope, but not common hemp or plant fiber rope. When Cantrell examined it more closely, his stomach turned. Hair. Human hair braided into functional rope. Strands of different colors, faded blonde, brown, even some gray hairs, all interwoven in a tight pattern strong enough to support weight. There were several feet of length, with ends showing signs of use, friction wear, discoloration. Someone had collected human hair, probably from multiple sources, and meticulously braided it into a functional tool. Local residents were consulted about the cabin. An elderly man who had lived in the region his entire life vaguely remembered that a solitary hunter had built it around 1840, perhaps even earlier. It had been abandoned since approximately 1850, as far as informal community records indicated. The cabin really did seem abandoned for considerable time. The discovery raised impossible questions. Were these ancient crimes buried for decades with no connection to recent disappearances? Or was there some deeper pattern? 3 people had been killed and decapitated, but exactly when, by whom, and more disturbingly, why? Cantrell made a decision that would fundamentally change the scope of the investigation. If there was one cabin with hidden human remains, probability suggested there could be others. He completely reformulated the search strategy. They weren't looking for lost men who might be injured anymore. They were looking for places, structures, caves, camps, where people had been deliberately hidden. It took a little over a month of systematic searching. On July 23rd, during patrol of a different area about 6 miles from the first cabin in a distinct direction, another structure was found. This one was considerably more recent, built perhaps 15 or 20 years ago based on the condition of the wood. Although also abandoned, it wasn't in such an advanced state of deterioration. The door still closed with effort. A significant part of the roof remained intact, and when the men forced the door open and entered, the smell hit them. Old decomposition, not fresh like recently dead meat, but the sweet, sickening and persistent odor of rancid fat that had permeated the wood. Old blood oxidized to a brown-black tone, and something more chemical that made nostrils burn. Large pots, the type used to process large quantities of food, were stacked in a corner. When Cantrell examined the interior of one, he found hardened, encrusted residue, something organic that had been boiled repeatedly until it turned into a dark crust on the metal. Small white fragments were mixed in the substance. Bones. Stacked against the wall were clothes, not 1 or 2 forgotten items, but dozens of pieces. Men's coats in varied styles covering decades of rural fashion, women's dresses in different states of deterioration, even small clothes that could only be children's, all stained with dark substances. The clothes covered an impressive period, from styles of the 1840s to pieces that seemed only a few years old. It appeared someone was systematically collecting clothes from different people over a long time. In a particularly dark corner, where the roof remained more intact blocking light, Cantrell found something that made bile rise in his throat. A crude wooden box, built without particular skill but functional, filled with human teeth. Dozens of them, perhaps more than 100, in various states of preservation. Some were large molars with long roots characteristic of adults. Others were too small, small incisors and tiny canines, baby teeth from children. It appeared someone was collecting them systematically, or that entire heads had been processed somehow and the teeth simply saved. Next to the box of teeth, blocks of something that initially looked like poorly made homemade soap. Cantrell picked one up, turning it in his hands. The texture was greasy, left an oily residue on fingers. The smell was slightly sweet, nauseating. Soap made from animal fat was common in rural areas. Poor families made their own. But there was something about these blocks, about the specific smell and the way the fat had been processed, that made Cantrell look at the stained pots, at the box of teeth, at the piles of clothes, and feel growing, horrible certainty about the source. Hunting knives in various states of rust were scattered around the cabin. Primitive axes, some with broken handles. Stained ropes hanging from hooks on the walls. And some of these ropes, upon closer examination, showed the same strange construction as the one found in the first cabin. Braided human hair. Different textures and colors mixed. And on the floor, boards stained with extensive discolorations. Large areas where something had spilled repeatedly, soaking the wood deeply. This time, curiously, there were no skulls. No large identifiable bones. If people had died here, and the accumulated evidence strongly suggested yes, their remains had been removed, destroyed, or dispersed more completely than in the first cabin. This indicated deliberate variation in method or evolution of techniques. Cantrell began to perceive a geographical and behavioral pattern. Both cabins were well away from main trails, but not so remote as to be inaccessible. Both were strategically close to water sources, creeks, springs. Both offered functional shelter despite abandoned appearance, and more revealingly, both had clearly been inhabited at different times, not simultaneously but in sequence. It seemed someone lived in one cabin for a determined period, abandoned it when local resources ran out, and moved to another structure miles away. The image forming was of a fundamentally nomadic predator, or predators. They didn't remain in a fixed location. They moved through the mountains in a broad pattern, killing opportunistically, using existing structures instead of building their own, and abandoning each site when it became inconvenient. This would explain why no one had found them. There was no fixed base to locate, just a series of temporary shelters scattered across vast territory. The connection to Ashford and Hodge was still circumstantial, but increasingly difficult to ignore. The distances were measurable in miles. The directions, though not forming an obvious pattern, all fell within a relatively defined region of the Smokies. And somewhere in these same mountains, in a cabin that hadn't been found yet, but existed as certainly as the others, life continued in its primitive and relentless rhythm. Bones were processed efficiently, and attention was already turning to the horizon, always alert. August arrived with oppressive heat that transformed the mountain air into something almost liquid, dense, humid, difficult to breathe deeply. The cabin discoveries had spread through the local community with the speed of fire in dry grass, transforming vague apprehension into concrete fear that changed behaviors. People who once walked alone on familiar trails now traveled exclusively in groups. Farmers who had never worried about security began checking door locks, fixing broken hinges, and reinforcing door frames. Children were kept close to home. And when Sarah Macklin disappeared on August 12th, the panic that had been silently growing exploded into open hysteria. Sarah was 19 years old, only daughter of James Macklin, a respected farmer whose family had cultivated the same land for 3 generations. She was known to everyone within a 15-mile radius, a quiet but kind girl, always willing to help sick neighbors with medicinal herbs she collected and prepared according to recipes passed down by her grandmother. She had left on the morning of August 12th to collect herbs in a specific area she had been visiting weekly since she was 14, a place she knew as well as her own backyard. A grove near a creek where certain plants grew in abundance. She should have returned by noon, as she always did. The sun began to set, and Sarah hadn't returned. James Macklin, initially irritated thinking she had gotten distracted, mounted his horse and followed the well-worn trail she always used. What he found made his heart plummet. Sarah's herb basket was overturned among the roots of an old tree, its contents scattered in a semicircle. Medicinal plants, valerian, ginseng, blue cohosh, were dispersed among the leaves, some already wilting in the heat. No blood, no sign of Sarah. By the following morning, practically before dawn, Marshal Cantrell was at the Macklin farm with a search force that quickly grew to 80 men, practically every physically capable man in 3 neighboring counties, many leaving unfinished harvests and unwatched cattle to participate. The search was fundamentally different this time. They weren't looking for someone who might be lost or injured anymore. They were hunting. Cantrell divided the men into groups of at least 4, all armed with rifles, pistols, hunting knives. Orders were explicit. Investigate any and all structures, no matter how abandoned or deteriorated they seemed. Cabins, rudimentary hunting shelters, even natural caves large enough to serve as human shelter. For 6 complete days, teams scoured the mountains in a systematic pattern that expanded outward from where Sarah's basket had been found. They discovered cabins, so many that Cantrell eventually lost count. The vast majority were genuinely abandoned for decades, empty except for raccoon nests or owls. But the men were deeply nervous now, jumping at every unexpected sound. A region that once seemed simply wild now seemed actively hostile. Old rumors that had been relegated to campfire stories began to resurface with new seriousness. Stories about wild people who supposedly lived in the deepest parts of the mountains, people who had abandoned civilization generations ago and lived like animals. An elderly farmer swore with trembling voice that he had seen hunched figures moving near his property several nights in a row. Pigs that had disappeared inexplicably from isolated pens over recent years, always attributed to bears or common thieves, now took on sinister significance. It was a group investigating a particularly closed valley on the afternoon of the 18th day, a valley surrounded by steep rock walls on 3 sides and accessible only through a narrow passage, that noticed something that made everyone stop instantly. Smoke. A thin column of grey smoke rising above the tree canopy. Smoke meant controlled fire. Controlled fire meant people. The group's leader, a war veteran named Elias Drummond, raised his hand in a silent signal to stop. Everyone froze, breaths held. The cabin they eventually located, approaching with extreme caution, was primitive even by the low standards of the mountains. Visibly crude construction, logs poorly fitted to each other with irregular gaps filled by a mixture of mud, moss, and plant fibers. A single room, no real windows, just rectangular openings covered with animal skins that blocked light, but allowed minimal ventilation. But it was unequivocally inhabited. Fresh smoke rose from the primitive chimney of stacked stones, and an improvised pen nearby contained 3 skinny pigs feeding on scraps and vegetation thrown on the muddy ground. Deer skins, in various states of preparation, were hung to dry on a crude structure made of tied branches. It looked like the property of an extremely poor farmer, except that no known farmer, not even the most isolated ones, lived in this specific part of the mountains. Drummond sent his fastest man back to fetch Cantrell and reinforcements. It took almost 2 hours until the marshal arrived, bringing 6 more men. Now there were 12 men positioned in a semicircle around the structure, rifles and pistols ready, covering all possible escape routes. Cantrell approached until he was approximately 20 feet from the closed door, took a deep breath, and identified himself as federal authority, ordering the occupants to exit with their hands visible. Absolute silence. Only the crackling of fire inside the cabin, audible through the gaps and wind in the trees above. He repeated the command, even louder this time. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The men checked their weapons nervously, expecting the door to explode with violence. But when it finally opened, it was slow and careful, without any urgency, or as if urgency were an unknown concept to whoever was inside. A man emerged into the filtered light. He appeared to be approximately 30 years old, thin but muscular in a wiry way. Hair and beard long, grown without cutting for years, tangled with small debris, pieces of leaf, small twigs, dirty in a way that went beyond lack of recent bathing. Deep, ingrained dirt. But what the man was wearing made several of the armed men take involuntary steps backward. He wore a coat, not a common farmer's or hunter's coat, but a specific dark coat with a distinct cut and, more revealingly, with a federal insignia embroidered on the left chest, the unmistakable seal of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Charles Ashford's coat. The man literally wore the dead federal inspector's clothes. Below the coat, patches of other clothes, pants mended with so many different pieces of fabric, it was impossible to tell what the original material was. And over his shoulders, an additional coat made of sewn animal skins, deer mainly, but also what appeared to be bear fur in parts. Cantrell ordered again that he raise his hands. The man, John, though no one knew yet, blinked slowly, but didn't obey. He didn't seem defiant or hostile, more that the command didn't register as relevant to him. Two of Cantrell's men advanced quickly, grabbed the man by the arms and forced him to turn facing the wall. He didn't resist in any way, just allowed himself to be maneuvered, muscles relaxed, without tension. Cantrell shouted, asking if there was anyone else inside. For a long moment, nothing. Then movement in the interior shadows. A smaller figure slowly materialized, emerging into the light. A woman, equally dirty, equally thin, moving strangely, slightly crouched, as if fully upright posture were uncomfortable. She held something against her chest with both arms, something small wrapped in dirty fabrics that moved slightly. A child. The woman wore something that initially seemed to be a simple dress, but upon closer examination, revealed itself to be a disturbing construction. Literally, dozens of pieces of different fabrics, all obviously from women's dresses, sewn together in a pattern with no apparent order. Floral patches next to plain fabrics, coarse cotton next to deteriorated fine silk. It was a dress made from dresses of multiple different women, patched repeatedly over what must be years. And over this, similar to the man, she wore a crude coat of animal skins. 4 men cautiously entered the cabin while John and Edith were firmly restrained outside, tied with ropes. The smell that hit them when they crossed the threshold was so intense that 2 men immediately exited, bending and vomiting violently among the nearby trees. It wasn't just lack of hygiene. It was active decomposition mixed with old decomposition, accumulated urine, feces, and something sweet that made battlefield memories involuntarily surface. On the packed earth floor near the stone fireplace, 2 human skulls rested casually. Clean, disarticulated. One still had long strands of blonde hair attached to fragments of dried scalp. What made Cantrell stop when he finally entered was what was around the skulls. Horse skulls, 3 of them, stacked without ceremony near the human skulls. Large, unmistakable in their distinct shape, and scattered around the fireplace area, mixed with bones clearly from deer and other game animals, were long bones that could only be from horses, characteristic femurs, thick tibias. They hadn't just killed the people, they had killed and consumed the horses too. Meat was meat. There was no distinction. Large iron pots, some clearly very old and others more recent, were stacked with dark residue encrusted on their surfaces. One large pot was still positioned over low embers in the fireplace, containing something that bubbled very slightly. Thick broth, with barely identifiable pieces of meat and bone fragments floating. The smell coming from this pot was distinct and horrible. Near the fireplace, homemade candles burned on improvised holders. But the smell of these candles, when Cantrell approached, was similar to that of the soap found in the previous cabin. Processed human fat. Candles made from dead people, illuminating the home of their killers. Extensive piles of bones were scattered without organization around. Approximately 18 years old, Ezra had impregnated her. The baby was born with deformities she described through gestures: malformed skull, twisted limbs. The child died within days. She buried it alone while John and Ezra were hunting. That first child wasn't John's, but from the uncle who had abused her. The subsequent children, all from John after they began a consanguineous relationship, followed a tragically similar pattern. Extremely difficult births in dirty cabins without any assistance. Babies born with obvious deformities, visibly malformed heads, twisted or partially developed limbs. Edith buried them near where they lived. There was no mourning in the usual sense, just practical acceptance that babies didn't survive. The only one who lived beyond a few months was the boy found, approximately 2 years old, but with the appearance and development of a 10-month-old baby. With John and Edith's arrest, authorities systematically scoured the region around the inhabited cabin. About 100 meters from the main structure, following an almost invisible trail, they found something that explained where much of the disposal went. A deep hole dug into the earth, descending at an angle. The smell when approaching was unbearable, concentrated decomposition from years. Careful investigation of the hole revealed disturbing contents: bones, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. The vast majority were from animals: deer, pigs, rabbits, even birds. And horses. Unmistakable skulls, enormous femurs, thick vertebrae. Dispersed among them, human bones. Difficult to count exactly how many individuals. Conservative estimates suggested at least 2 complete sets. Years of accumulated disposal. Inedible parts, bones processed for marrow. On September 12th, teams found a 4th cabin, 12 miles from the first, also abandoned for years, containing 3 skulls buried in a hole in the floor. Clothes from 2 men and a woman, styles clearly from the 1850s. More primitive knives, more ropes, some of hemp, others disturbingly made of braided human hair. Additional blocks of that oily soap. September 20th brought an even more disturbing discovery. A natural cave, opening wide enough to serve as shelter, located 5 miles from the inhabited cabin. Evidence of very old fires marked the stone floor. Compacted ashes, blackened stones in a circle. And scattered through the cave in chaotic profusion were bones, so many that counting individual victims became impossible. Humans and animals mixed, fragmented by time, some clearly very old. The cave seemed to have been a previous dwelling, perhaps the first place where Ezra, John, and Edith had lived when they arrived in 1848. In early October, a 5th cabin was located through persistent search, 14 miles from the first in a different direction. 4 skulls buried in shallow graves near the structure. More clothes from multiple decades. More primitive and improvised tools. The pattern was undeniable and systematic. Movement through vast territory. Occupation of existing structures for varied periods. Opportunistic murders. The investigation also found in the various cabins evidence of how they had sustained themselves materially over so long. Clothes extensively patched using fabrics from multiple victims. Taken tools, knives, axes, even 2 old and rusted firearms. Cooking pots obviously from different origins. Those disturbing ropes of braided human hair found in multiple locations. They literally used everything from their victims. The final count they could confirm with some degree of certainty was 14 human victims, 2 directly identified, Charles Ashford and Sarah Macklin, 12 represented by skulls and bones found in the various cabins and cave that could never be named. But absolutely everyone understood, without need for discussion, that the real number was probably higher. Bones decompose completely over decades. Scavenging animals disperse remains. Years of rain and vegetation hide evidence. When Cantrell directly asked how many people they had killed, John was silent for a long time, looking at his own hands. Then, slowly, he admitted he didn't know, that they didn't count that way. Pressed to at least estimate, he tried counting on his fingers, moved his lips silently, got lost, gave up with visible frustration. He could only indicate it was more than the fingers on his hands, more than 10. probably less than 20 based on the catalogued physical evidence, but that was Cantrell's speculation. Edith, when asked the same thing in a separate session, simply didn't remember them all. Not with sadness or horror, but with genuine indifference of someone describing forgotten meals from years ago. People were food. Food was consumed to continue living. Life continued. When he began asking specifically about methods, they responded with disturbing frankness. Solitary travelers were easier and safer. Someone stopping to rest near a creek, unarmed or with weapons stored. Simple ambush, John from one side, Edith from the other. Death was usually quick, not out of mercy but out of pure practicality. Struggle meant noise, noise meant risk. So they killed efficiently and processed the bodies the same way they would process any large game. They consumed the fleshy parts, muscles mainly, cooked in large cauldrons. They broke long bones to access marrow. Skulls were discarded because little useful meat remained. If the victim possessed a cabin or camp, they occupied it for months or even years. When food ran out, they abandoned and sought new territory. A local doctor with limited training was called to evaluate the prisoner's mental condition. He made a crucial observation. John and Edith weren't stupid or intellectually deficient. They spoke well when they wanted to, understood complex concepts when explained, solved practical problems with reasonable intelligence. What was lacking wasn't basic cognitive capacity. It was the entire moral and social structure that humans normally develop through interaction with society from childhood. They were, in essence, humans raised like wild animals. They maintained basic human intelligence and language capacity because they had been exposed to it in the first 9 and 10 years. But they operated under survival instincts without filter of morality, empathy, or social conscience. They didn't feel guilt because guilt requires understanding that one has violated an ethical norm, and they had no norms. They didn't feel fear of punishment because punishment was an abstract concept they had never encountered. The doctor concluded his official report with a somber observation. Regardless of legal guilt, they were dangerous not through intentional malice, but through absence of the inhibitions that keep the rest of humanity from killing when it would be convenient. They were humans without developed humanity, and there was no path to rehabilitation. The trial of John and Edith Godfrey began on November 9, 1869, in Knoxville's federal court. The room was packed far beyond capacity, morbid curiosity surpassing any sense of decency. People wanted to see with their own eyes the couple who had lived like animals and killed like predators. What they saw disappointed them in terms of spectacle, but disturbed them in deeper ways. John and Edith sat side by side in the defendant's bench, cleaned for the first time in decades. Clothes provided by the court made them look almost normal, except for the expression. Even surrounded by people occasionally shouting for their heads, they maintained that same expressionless face. They didn't seem frightened, defiant, or remorseful. They seemed, if anything, slightly bored. The procedure seemed an irrelevant inconvenience. The prosecution was direct and devastating. 14 counts of first-degree murder, cannibalism, and federal theft of Charles Ashford's tax money. The prosecution presented evidence methodically. Clean skulls displayed on a table, identified victims' clothes, tools found in the cabins, testimony after testimony from men who had discovered the sites. James Macklin, Sarah's father, testified on the second day with a voice that broke repeatedly. He described Sarah in moving details, young, full of life, engaged to a young local farmer, planning a wedding the following spring. When, with a voice trembling with rage and pain, he pointed directly at Edith and asked how she could have killed his innocent girl. Edith didn't react. She didn't even look in his direction. She simply observed her own hands resting in her lap. The defense, led by a court-appointed attorney who clearly didn't want the case, argued legal insanity. He meticulously presented the history of systematic abuse, Ezra fleeing accusations of incest, kidnapping of 2 innocent children, forced isolation for 21 years without any contact with civilization. He argued they couldn't be held responsible for actions when they didn't possess developed capacity to understand basic concepts of morality. But the prosecution counter-argued with a devastatingly effective point. Capacity to plan demonstrated knowledge. The ambushes weren't random or impulsive. They deliberately chose isolated victims, attacked when chances of escape were minimal, hid when larger groups passed. This clearly demonstrated understanding of consequences. If they knew they needed to hide their actions, then they knew those actions were wrong. The jury of 12 men listened without easily interpretable expression. Some looked at John and Edith with obvious hatred, jaws clenched. Others with something closer to fascinated horror. A few seemed genuinely conflicted, expressions showing recognition of tragedy in the entire situation, even while recognizing the necessity of justice. On the third day, after presentation of all evidence and final arguments, the jury retired for deliberation. They returned after 2 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all presented charges. Sentence was mandatory under federal law for multiple homicides. Death by public hanging. Date set for December 6th, less than a month away. There would be no appeals. There would be no clemency. When sentence was read by the judge with solemn voice, John and Edith didn't react visibly. They didn't cry. They didn't protest or deny. They simply continued sitting with the same neutral expression. When guards approached to take them back to their cell, they went passively, without resistance. They seemed not to understand they would be killed, or understood, but the knowledge didn't penetrate emotionally. The following weeks were strangely quiet. A local priest, an elderly man with genuine compassion, visited daily trying to offer religious comfort and prepare what he hoped were souls for meeting with the Creator. John and Edith listened to his prayers and Bible readings politely, without interrupting, but never responded in a way that suggested understanding. The concept of an omniscient God, of heaven and hell as eternal destinations, of redemption through repentance, it was all simply too strange to penetrate decades of isolation. The priest eventually gave up on genuine conversion. He confided to Cantrell in a low voice that he didn't know if they were lost souls or if they had never had developed souls to begin with. 3 days before the scheduled execution, Edith made an unusual request. First time she initiated communication voluntarily. She wanted to see her son. Marshal Cantrell denied the request. The child was gravely ill in the state orphanage, visibly failing despite medical care. It certainly wouldn't be appropriate to bring him for a final visit with a mother about to be executed. Edith didn't react to the denial, didn't argue, simply returned to silence. But that night, the night guard making regular rounds reported something deeply disturbing. Around 2 in the morning, the darkest and quietest hour, he heard sound coming from Edith's cell. He approached silently, looked through the small opening in the door. Edith was awake, sitting on the floor with her back against the cold stone wall, looking at an empty corner of the cell, and she was singing, not recognizable words in English or any language, not a familiar melody. It was a sound almost animal in quality, off-key, guttural, but undeniably an attempt at a lullaby. Repetitive, monotonous, strange, but with the gentle rhythm of rocking a baby. The only time in entire months of imprisonment that she demonstrated anything remotely resembling genuine maternal emotion. She sang for hours until the first rays of light began to filter. Afterward, never again. She returned to silence. December 6, 1869 arrived with a cold morning and extraordinarily clear sky. The gallows had been erected in the central public square during previous days, a somber structure that attracted nervous glances. The crowd that gathered to witness was estimated at approximately 800 people, a notable number for a city the size of Knoxville. Some came out of a sense of justice. Others, probably the majority, out of morbid curiosity. Still others because public executions were, however disturbing it sounds, social events where the community gathered. John and Edith were brought in a closed wagon, still tied, still silent. When they descended and were led to the gallows steps, the crowd expected, some openly, others secretly, a dramatic final confession, desperate pleas for forgiveness, perhaps even last-moment violent rebellion. None of this happened. Both walked with the same passivity they demonstrated in everything. When they were positioned under ropes hanging from the beam, when dark fabric hoods were placed over their heads, they didn't resist. The priest offered a final prayer with a voice that carried through the silent square. He asked the Lord to receive these lost souls, products of sins they didn't initially commit but perpetuated terribly. He asked forgiveness for them, for they truly didn't know what they were doing. It was an intentional echo of Christ's words on the cross, and some in the crowd murmured audible disapproval. Comparing these murderers to Christ seemed intolerable blasphemy. At exactly 11:47 in the morning, the executioner pulled the lever. Trapdoors opened simultaneously. Both ropes had been measured with mathematical precision. Length calculated based on weights to ensure necks broke cleanly, causing instant death as protocol required. The two bodies fell, stopped abruptly, swung slightly in the cold wind. Death was instantaneous for both. Bodies were left hanging for a complete hour as regulation required, before being lowered. There were no funerals or religious services. There were no family members claiming bodies. They were placed in unmarked graves in the paupers' cemetery on the outskirts, buried in extreme opposite corners of the grounds, even in death kept separate. No wooden cross marked the locations, no stone with names, no prayer beyond that of the priest at the gallows. The earth accepted them without ceremony. The boy, named Lewis by the orphanage staff for lack of any other name, survived an additional 6 months in the state orphanage. He never improved. He refused food more frequently than accepting it. He never developed speech. He didn't respond to affection offered by caregivers. He didn't interact with other children. In June 1870, he died during the night without signs of struggle or obvious suffering. Cause listed in the official death record was simply failure to thrive, a vague medical term used when children stopped eating, stopped interacting with the world, and simply let themselves die. He was buried in the orphanage's small cemetery, the final victim of a cycle of abuse that had begun decades earlier with Ezra Godfrey's choices. And Ezra, his body was never found despite occasional searches in following years. Cantrell occasionally thought about it on nights when case memories kept him awake. Where was the body of the man who had started all the horror? Dead of disease in some lost cabin decades ago, skeleton dispersed by animals? Or was there something more sinister in John's strange phrase about his father sleeping too deeply? Perhaps when they were teenagers, when John was becoming physically stronger and Edith more resentful, they had taken a final measure of survival and primitive justice. It would be poetic justice in a dark way. The man who created monsters being destroyed by them, but without direct confession, without a body, it remained only speculation. The Great Smoky Mountains region continued being a place of mysteries and occasional disappearances. In the years following the trial, stories occasionally surfaced of old cabins discovered with strange belongings or bones found far from known trails. Some were superficially investigated. Most weren't. Mountains were vast. Death was a natural part of the landscape, and resources for investigations were limited. Cantrell, who would officially retire in 1875, occasionally returned to the Godfrey case files on quiet nights. He read reports of discovered cabins, counted skulls in official inventory, and wondered about real numbers. 14 victims were officially confirmed. But how many cabins were never found? How many bones lay in unmapped caves? If John and Edith operated for 12 years after Ezra's death, killing approximately one person per year, but Ezra had raised them and presumably operated for 9 years before, the dark mathematics suggested the real total of deaths over decades could easily be 30, 40, possibly even 50 people. Entire generations of violence hidden under tree canopies. Each victim just another forgotten meal, each death just another set of bones in the pile. But perhaps some secrets were genuinely better left buried. The families of known victims had their answers, however painful. Justice had been served through legal process. And for the rest of the anonymous dead, the mountains would keep their eternal silence. Grass growing over unmarked graves, wind sighing through empty cabins that no one would ever visit again. What happened with John and Edith Godfrey was one of the darkest chapters in the Appalachian region. Not because of the violence itself, but because of what it reveals about what happens when humanity is systematically removed from people. When their execution occurred in December 1869, there was no doubt that justice had been served. They were monsters who needed to be eliminated. 14 confirmed victims, possibly 50 over decades, leave no room for hesitation or sympathy. Charles Ashford had a wife and children waiting for him at home. Sarah Macklin was planning her wedding for the following spring. William Hodge had a family that never knew what happened to him. And the other 11, whose names we'll never know, and whose skulls were found buried in forgotten cabins, had their own stories, unrealized dreams, fears that ended up being justified, people who loved them and died without answers. John and Edith killed them without remorse, processed them like animals, and consumed them without distinction between human flesh and deer meat. They were predators who needed to be stopped. But the darker truth, the one that bothers precisely because it complicates the simple narrative of good versus evil, is that these monsters were deliberately created. The true villain wasn't in the courtroom in 1869. Ezra Godfrey had died years before, without facing justice for creating a killing machine that would operate decades after his death. He was the point of origin, the first sin that would echo through generations in increasingly larger waves of perpetuated trauma and violence. Ezra tore 2 children from society at 9 and 10 years old, dragged them into the deepest isolation of the mountains, and systematically subjected them to years of abuse. He taught them to see other humans only as threats or resources. He never allowed them to understand concepts like empathy, morality, or the intrinsic value of human life. And when he finally died, probably at the hands of the very victims he had created, he left behind 2 people who were human only in biology, but animals in everything else. And perhaps, in the depths of the mountains where civilization never completely penetrated, other similar cycles continued. Children growing up not knowing another way of life existed. People becoming less than human because they never had a chance to be anything else. Sufficient isolation, sufficient deprivation, sufficient abuse. All of this can transform any person into something unrecognizable. The Great Smoky Mountains remain extraordinarily beautiful. Valleys covered in fog at dawn, ancient forests where trees have lived for centuries, trails that invite adventurers and nature lovers. But for those who know this specific story, there's always an underlying awareness. The line between human and animal can become terrifyingly thin in places remote enough, when isolation lasts too long, when there are no witnesses to remind people what it means to be human. This is the permanent and disturbing lesson. Not that monsters exist naturally waiting in shadows, but that monsters are made. By specific circumstances, by systematic abuse that extends through formative years, by isolation that removes all reference to normalcy. John and Edith Godfrey deserved their executions. They were dangerous, unrehabilitatable, and had caused immeasurable suffering. But they were also products of a greater monstrosity that preceded them. Thank you for following this investigation to the end. If you made it this far, leave a comment sharing what you thought of this dark story. And remember, when entering wild and remote places, always pay attention to your surroundings. Because not everything that seems completely empty really is.